eyes in the sky, gazing far into the night. I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light shine through. If you believe it's true, baby, won't you let the light shine through for you.
Welcome to Deception Detection Radio. I'm Kay.
And I'm Chad.
We pray you all had a blessed week. We're excited to have rejoining us tonight Mark Dwayne Colmes, author of the fascinating book In the Beginning. Mark is a graduate of Arlington Baptist College. He is a self-described critical investigative researcher. Mark is fascinated by ancient biblical history and the origin of man. He's also an event moderator and public speaker. Tonight we will be discussing Mark's book, In the Beginning. Hi, Mark. Welcome back to Deception Detection Radio. How are you?
I'm fabulous. Thank you, Kay. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be able to join you.
Oh, it's great to have you. And this time we've got Chad that will be able to join in. I'm really excited about that.
I'm really nervous about that. So we'll...
He knows you, Chad.
I'm going to have a few words with Gary Wayne. He's apparently...
I was about 50% excited and 50% nervous, and as we got closer to our start time, it's nervous is winning out, so I'm about 15% excited and about 85% nervous at this point. So
shame on you, Chad.
Hey, and I can't claim going through a tunnel because we're not on cell phones, so,
Uh-oh. That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, well, how about I go ahead and say tonight's prayer, and then we're going to get started on this.
All right.
Okay? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing Mark on with us again. It's so wonderful to have him on, to fellowship with him, and catch up on what research he's been doing and the progress of his new book. And we still have things, Lord, that we want to find out about his first book, In the Beginning. And we just thank you so much for placing him here for that. Please, Father, guide tonight's broadcast. Let your words be our words. Let the ears of our listeners be opened and their hearts softened. We love you, Lord, and we want to do your work. And we just ask that you bless tonight, that you lay hands on everything, everyone who's listening, all of us, our equipment, so that no interference may come between getting your word out, Lord. And we thank you for all that you do, and we love you. In Jesus' holy name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, Mark, would you like to tell everyone a little bit about yourself, for anyone who may not know who you are?
Well, I'm in my mid-50s, so I'm nearing retirement and half excited about that and half nervous about that. But in my mid-50s, I have a lovely wife named Kathy. We live in northern Florida. Put out my first book in January of 2015, so just a little over a year and a half ago, and have been privileged to have some wonderful people offer me interview opportunities to talk about the book. It's been pretty well received from most folks. I absolutely appreciate anyone who has taken the time to pick it up and browse through it and contact me, ask questions, things of that nature. The book itself, I think I described it this way last time, Kay. It's kind of my personal journey more than anything else. I didn't set out to change anyone's mind on anything. This was just my personal journey looking at some questions about the flood of Noah and the story of the ark and how these things, if they did happen, how could they have possibly happened? I had some of my own questions, and I just started digging for answers. I felt like they were legitimate questions, and hopefully the responses that we brought to light in the book are things that people will be able to look at and say the research brings to light some things that are worthy of genuine consideration. And if we can get someone to set aside their own personal beliefs, whatever they may be, and think and reason and consider this story as something that maybe, possibly, actually happened, then we've got two things going on. Number one, it's one of the most important stories in the history of the world because it changes our planet. And number two, it opens the door for a lot of other things that introduce us to the world of the Bible and God's plan for mankind. And it's been a fascinating journey.
Well, your book is a fascinating journey. I mean, from the first page to the end of it is just, it's so well done. And I recommend anyone who hasn't read it, get a copy and read it and let everyone know about it because it's really an eye-opener.
Well, I appreciate that very much. We've gotten, I think, 15 reviews on Amazon. So, if someone has picked it up and they've read it and they found it interesting and it helped them think, a review on Amazon goes a long, long way towards other people that it pops up in their screen and they see some reviews and they look at those. And I really appreciate those. And as I said, I'm always open to people asking me questions because that helps me put some other things into the research that, I can spend my time investigating and trying to dig up. And that's what I enjoy doing.
It's great. Well, what we're going to do is take up kind of where we left off. You have an update about the mysterious sky object that you had detailed in the appendix of In the Beginning. And you were able to fill in a spot about the 360-year cycle of this object. Can you give everyone updates on that, please, Mark?
Yeah, I have to say up front that this object, most people would put it under the category of Planet X, Nibiru, something along that line. I want to let people know right up front, I am not a fearmonger. I am not a person that predicts that this planet is going to swing back around the sun next week and destroy everything that we know. I think our Lord, our God who created everything that we know, I believe he has a plan for mankind, and I don't think we need to live in fear. So let me get that out of the way right up front. I've had people interview me, and at times they put a lot of focus on this particular, what I refer to as a planetary object or a sky object, simply because I wanted to separate just a little bit from that. What I wanted to find was documentation in history, and I didn't go looking for it. It came and found me, and I kind of introduce it in the book by way of some of the research where we're looking at other cultural stories about the flood that are gleaned and gathered and collected from civilizations around the world through ancient history, stories that have been passed down, and how many of them actually include a large sky object that appeared or that was a part of the catastrophe that unfolded. Now, I got this information not from a biblical resource, but from a secular resource, and he wasn't necessarily researching anything on a biblical end. He's just looking at a collection of what he would term flood myths or flood stories and pulling them all together. And so we began to tie things together with that and put together some other aspects that were kind of tied by all these stories to the initial aspect of the flood itself. Things like a large object in the sky, things like a large earthquake, and things of that nature. A lot of these would make sense if the planet was going to come apart at the seams, as the Bible would describe for us. The fountains of the deep broke up. You can color that in any way that you want to, but I would have to say that it's an experience that would be on the range of catastrophic. So we looked at those types of things, and then I began to look at historical appearances of an unusual object in the sky, and I began to just put those dates on a timeline. I didn't do it to try and prove something. I was just marking things and setting it aside for my research. And as I started doing that, what I found was that a pattern was developing. And so, whereas I mentioned that in the book, I spent an entire appendix on going through these historical appearances that I found and putting them on a date line or on a calendar, tying in the flood itself, tying in an event that the book of Jasher records for us that happened before the flood, and we were able to compare the people that event affected, that happened in their lifetime, along with the time period of the flood, and kind of get a date range as to where that happened. And we went into details of that in this particular appendix. And then we went forward to the Tower of Babel, and then we went forward to other historical events that we can document that there was a very unusual happening. One of those time sequences falls at the time of the crucifixion. We have recorded for us in the Gospels and in secular material outside the Gospels of a 3-hour eclipse of the sun, or a 3-hour period of darkness. Some of this is recorded by ancient church fathers, some of it's recorded in the Gospels, but some of it is also recorded by people who would not be friends of Christianity. They were actually enemies of the cross, so to speak. They were writing about this as well. And so we brought that all into play in the book. The question being, with that particular event, how do you have an eclipse that lasts for 3 hours? And knowing that the time of the crucifixion was the time of Passover, which would coincide with the full moon, you wouldn't have an eclipse of the sun by the moon. Just doesn't happen that way. The planetary alignment is such that the moon could not eclipse the sun and be full at the same time. So all of those things we kind of took into play as we dealt with that little aspect of the timeline, along with the earthquake that's described by a couple of the gospel writers. So we have those things in place. We have a couple of Old Testament stories that we went into in detail from the books of Amos and Zechariah, and then we went into more modern history moving forward into time periods that we could see, all the way up to 1744 AD, which is just a few hundred years ago. Now, one of the items that we have in that list occurs in 1486 BC, or at least that's where the documentation was putting it, and it was connecting two civilizations as having make observations about the same exact object at the same exact time. What I found since those two civilizations was Egypt and China. What I found since, through a couple of archaeologists and people that I trust as far as their research, is that the timetable for Egypt is a little bit off, as it is properly put forth by Egyptologists. There's some large gaps and large spaces in there. If any of your listeners has heard of the documentary Patterns of Evidence with Tim Mahoney, they talk about these gaps in the Egyptian timeline and the alignment of some of the pharaohs and when they ruled. Well, I entered into a conversation with an Egyptologist, archaeologist. He is not a Christian. He declares himself to be an agnostic, so he's not trying to support anything from the Bible, but he's very knowledgeable in these types of things, and his research bears that out. And I got a date for the Egyptian pharaoh that was ruling at the time this sky object appeared and was recorded in the documents in Egypt. And that date was about 340 years before the other date that I had it listed at, 1486 BC. So it actually moved into a time slot on that chart that's empty and left the other one filled. And I was kind of I won't say excited about that, but kind of intrigued that another time slot has filled in on that chart. And I know I'm kind of a little bit foggy in the information I'm giving here, because when you're looking at a time chart, it's great if you're doing a PowerPoint presentation. It doesn't really translate very well when you're doing just audio with folks. But this is something that will be updated in the next book when it comes out. I'm going to update that time chart a little bit more because I've got that event and one other that I want to put in there.
The time chart is really interesting to look at it. All the charting that you did in your book is, but to see the cycle repeat itself like that. And to be honest, most people that I've heard talk about a cycle, they want to put it out more to the 3,600 year. And what I've seen after reading your book is the fact that they're missing so many of the details that happened that actually hit the 360 close mark by doing only the 3,600 year.
Well, it's something that kind of surprised me. As I said, I just started marking dates on a calendar and setting it off to the side on my bulletin board and not really paying much attention until instead of having 3 or 4 dates on there, I had 5, 7, 9, and now it's starting to fill in, and I only had a couple of gaps. And it wasn't like I was saying, okay, I need something in this time range, let me go hunt for it. I was looking at an event and going, okay, well, when did this event happen? Oh, it happened here. Well, where does that fit on the chart? Oh, it would have fall into a reasonable time slot on the chart. So I kind of went about it in a backwards manner, and I felt like that was the most responsible way to go about it, rather than going, I've got a hole here in this chart, I need to go find some data to put in it. I thought that would be irresponsible looking at it that way.
It's going to be really interesting to see every time that you update just what is getting filled in.
And I want to do some math here real quick if we can. And I'll try to pull up my calculator for us so that we don't have to, because if I'm doing this in my head, it's going to get really messed up. But my brother all the time will say, well, according to your time chart, what's the next date that's out there? What date should we be looking at? And I, every single time, have to calculate it out to see what it is. But the last thing that I have in my chart is 1744 as far as time range, 1744 AD. And that one is listed, if you're looking it up, it's going to be listed as a comet. And you're also going to find information that tells you that comet exploded and it's no longer in existence. You're also going to find information that tells you that comet was unusually large. I think I found one documentation that I put in the book that it was 8 times the size of the full moon. That's enough to get me paying attention.
Really?
I also found information from the astronomers in China that recorded stuff at the same time about this object, that it passed close enough to the Earth to interact with what we know today as the Earth's magnetic field. I don't think in that time period they really understood about the Earth's magnetic field, but it passed close enough to the Earth that it produced audible sounds, and that's what they recorded. So it's a really interesting look at that particular object in 1744. If you add this cycle of about 360 or so years to that, you get into a time period that is, we're in 2016 now, you get into a time period of 2104. So when I see people tell me that Planet X or Nibiru is on the other side of the sun and it's going to be here at the end of August, that doesn't fit any of the research that I've come up with or anything that I'm looking at. And I have to kind of look at that, turn my head sideways, and pretty much dismiss it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
a lot of people are into the fear porn, and that's something that you definitely are not into. You deal with the facts.
Well, I deal with what facts that I can pull up and the best interpretation I can possibly put on those facts when I lay them side by side with other things that I can document. I'm not into speculation. I mean, it's fun conversation if we're sitting around somewhere having a cup of coffee, but if I'm putting together a book that's researched, I don't want to cheapen it by putting wild speculation in there. I may throw out a question for consideration, but I'm not going to position it as something of a hypothesis of this is what happens. In one area where I positioned something in the book, I clearly labeled it up front. This is my idea, and it may be subject to change. In every other area, I'm doing heavy documentation with footnotes. So people are knowing that this information is coming from reliable sources, and they can go and double check the sources on their own.
That's great. Shortly after Mark was on Deception Detection last time, he had posted a question into Truth Seekers Research, which is Chad's, and it had to do with the woolly mammoth and the Ice Age. And I'm going to let Mark tell us about that, but let me put it this way. I've been waiting all this time to get an answer to this question. So, Mark, I'm going to give it to you.
Oh, this is one of the things that just, it kind of led to me writing the book in the first place. It's one of those questions that I think is a legitimate question to ask that leaves you scratching your head, and that is, how did the Ice Age happen? And particularly, some of the animals that we find frozen in the ice. And we think of the woolly mammoths, but there's a lot more to it than that. I dealt with the Ice Age a little bit, I think in chapter 6. I think I dealt with the frozen mammoths and other things around those same areas. I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from the book if that's possible, and then we'll speculate just a little bit, because I'm going to tell you that I've got a good idea what needs to happen. I don't have a good idea of how it's possible, okay? But let's first clear up that we're talking about what we know today as Arctic climates, mostly inside the Arctic Circle at the North Pole, but also at the South Pole. The South Pole is a huge region that doesn't get nearly as much research promoted or research made available as the North Pole expeditions have. But I'm going to give you a quote from page 241 in the book that talks about an area near the Arctic Circle. The New Siberian Islands play host to a mixed array of animals preserved in the ice. Documented finds include the aforementioned mammoth, as well as rhinoceros, buffalo, musk ox, a few varieties of deer, and even horses. Numerous types of trees, including elm and hazel, which are not currently growing anywhere near the region, have also been excavated. And we have a footnote on that, so you'll know where I got that information. The next page, I quote, or I pull some information from a French scientist, Bernard Biguy, I think that's how we pronounce his name, but he claims to have located a virtual prehistoric zoo buried in the Arctic permafrost near the Siberian town of Katanga. Woolly rhinos, steppe lions, giant deer, foxes, and hardy breeds of horses are said to be among the identified residents. So we've got everything from lions to rhinoceros, and I read about camels, although it's not in either one of these two quotes, a variety of deer. We've got vegetation including elm and hazel trees. We've got other lush vegetation, things of that nature, all buried in the ice. Scientists today, or folks that talk about the mammoths today, will tell you that they thrived in a very cold climate, and they used their tusk to root under the ice to find things to eat. I'm going to submit just an idea, just a thought. This will be speculation. Chad, you can call me out on this if you want to, but I'm going to suggest that lush vegetation doesn't grow under sheets of ice. Just my thought.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
There is tons of lush vegetation that has been found in these Arctic climates, including large trees, tree trunks, things of that nature. This is kind of baffling. The only answer to that is that there was a time period where this was a thriving tropical climate that was not under the ice. The idea is that this is a part of what has transpired through plate tectonics and continental shifts, that this area was at one time not in the North Pole region, but much further south. Therefore, it thrived with all of these animals and the trees and things of that nature. The only question is, how fast did it move north and how fast did it freeze over? I mean, we've got animals that are frozen with food in their mouths and undigested food in their stomachs. That is a little bit of a quandary. The problem being that if you're going to freeze something with food in its stomach so that it doesn't rot, you have to do it very, 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 very quickly. My wife is from Montana, and it gets cold there. It doesn't get cold enough to freeze a woolly mammoth in a matter of minutes, but it gets cold there. And the hunters know that even in the winter, if you kill an animal, especially in the winter when it's really, really cold, if you shoot an elk or shoot an antelope, you have to dress it out on sight. If you don't, the external portion of the animal will begin to freeze, and it will lock all of the heat inside, and it will begin a rot. And by the time you get that animal back home to dress it out, it will be putrefied and unedible. You have to dress it out on sight. It's just the nature that things freeze from the outside in. What we have in these finds of woolly mammoths, and we documented a few of them in the book, but as I said, there's other animals as well. They froze so quickly that they are 100% preserved. Some of them with food in their mouths, some of them with food in their stomachs, some of them, as they have thawed out, the meat was still edible. And I have a couple of stories where they actually retrieved the meat from this and, sampled the meat. They got blood samples, and we have all of that documented in there. The question is, how do you freeze something that fast? And how fast would you have to freeze it? Now, I said a matter of minutes a while ago. I think it would actually have to be quicker than that. It certainly isn't a matter of hours or days or months. And that's what we hear with regard to the Ice Age, that it was a slow layering of the ice until we finally had an Ice Age. I think it was catastrophic. I think it was instantaneous. As far as how to freeze something, the research I did, Kay, in trying to come up with an answer for this one, you're going to love this. I actually researched Major League Baseball teams.
Oh.
So I got
really?
the information I'm about to give you from the field of sports, and I'm a huge baseball fan. And this is actually one of the things I stumble across from time to time. This is how I stumble across information and just have to hit the pause button, take a moment to pray and thank the Lord for throwing this in my lap, and then watch the rest of the story. But
that's neat, taking the sport and then finding out this information. I love baseball too, you know that.
Well, we were watching something the other night, and it was talking about the training regimen of we down here we get a lot of information on the Florida Marlins, the Miami Marlins, and so it was a little insider show on their training facility. And for some reason, I wanted to watch part of it, and I was about 10 minutes into it, and this popped up, and then I really, really wanted to watch it. As most athletes will do during their training, they'll do their physical training, their weight training, etc. But at the end of that, a lot of times they will take a bath in a tub of ice for recovery, and that's common. It's been going on for years and years and years. It is a shock to the system. It is a quick recovery for the system for muscles that have been stressed. And you have these huge ice tubs that people will jump into. Some of you who are familiar with watching sports on TV may have even seen the commercial that was done by the quarterback of the Carolina Panthers last year about, hey, that's my tub of ice. This is my ice tub. You're in my tub. Okay, well, I'm going to get in with you. I mean, I think it was a Gatorade commercial, but, that is common in all of these training facilities. And there's another thing that's common in all these training facilities that we may not know about, and it is called impact cryotherapy. If you're familiar with the term cryonics or freezing, where people will want to be frozen so that they can be unfrozen at a later time, that's kind of where the idea and the concept and the technology comes from. I think even Ted Williams had a part of him frozen, the rest of him buried, but I think that was a big situation with his family as to what they could and couldn't do according to his will several years back when the great hitter from the Boston Red Sox, Ted Williams, passed away. But anyway, these athletic teams use impact cryotherapy. What this is, it's a chamber that the athlete gets in, stands up in, and they close it around him almost like an Egyptian mummy case, and it covers everything from the neck down is inside of this. The head is the only thing that's sticking out. And then they pump super cold air in on the athlete for a very short period of time. And the information said that it gets down within a matter of about 3 minutes, it gets down to 160 degrees below zero within a matter of about 3 minutes. Now, I couldn't imagine being in that. But these athletes are in that for 3 minutes, super cold, freezing, 160 degrees below, and then when the therapy is over with, they open the chamber and they walk out and, warm back up to room temperature, okay? My point being, at 160 degrees below zero, 3 minutes isn't enough to even freeze the skin to the point of damage. So you've got a situation with how do you freeze a large animal like a woolly mammoth solid to the point that you do not have deterioration of the food that's in their stomach? How do you do that, and how do you do it quickly? It is a very interesting question to try and find out. I can tell you that it regards something that is super cold and happens super fast. There's no other way around that. When I researched liquid nitrogen, which was the coldest thing I was familiar with, it is 320 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. That's liquid nitrogen. When it warms up above that, it actually turns back into a gas. Liquid oxygen is only 297 degrees below Fahrenheit. Neon is another gas that will turn into a liquid at negative 411 degrees. Then you've got two elements that are actually in our atmosphere. One is hydrogen, which turns into a liquid at 423 degrees below zero. And the other one is the coldest that we're aware of. It's helium, which turns into a liquid at negative 452 degrees. Anything above that, and it turns back into a gas. So that's kind of where my research led me. What possibly could have happened in our atmosphere that caused an immediate freeze at the North and South poles and an onset of an ice age? It had to be something very, very catastrophic.
Do you have any guesses of what it could have possibly have been?
I think at the times that the heavens tore open, that our Earth went through this catastrophic change, I think it's entirely possible. Of course, in my book, I projected that there may have been a canopy of ice above the Earth. I think that's something that a lot of people would say, that they favor that idea. There's some people that don't, but a lot of people that do. But I think at that time, when you've got the atmosphere of the Earth going through a drastic, instantaneous change, you could have the possibility that certain elements would be separated. And in being separated, you could have the possibility that maybe one of these elements is isolated to the extent of causing something along this line. I know in the book of Peter, it says that at the end time, the elements will melt. And that is talking about elements being separated. And that could be what's going on here. Do I have anything that scientifically proves it? No, I don't. But neither does science. There's just not an answer to this question.
You had sent me an absolutely fascinating video and I'm sorry, I can't recall what it was called, but it was where everything started to freeze and it started coming up out of the water and just overtaking the land.
Mm-hmm.
Listeners might be interested in that. Can you tell them what that's called?
There's a handful of them, and some of them have foul language in it. Some of them don't. So depending on your particular preference, choose with caution. But I think if you Google ice, 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 tsunami, and that's TSU NAMI, NAMI. If you Google that on YouTube, you'll probably come up with one of the videos. There's I think somewhere between 6 and 10 of them out there. The one I sent you, I think it was about 5 or 6 minutes long, something like that.
It was.
And the ice started in the lake and started creeping up the shore, and people were watching it in their backyards. But in a matter of 4 or 5 minutes, it's up to the fact that it's encroaching upon the houses. And they are really like, what's going on here? We don't know. This, I think, dates to May of 2013. It was an unusual event, but it's happened in the past. This was really extreme. And the ice actually encroached all the way up upon some of the houses and actually did some pretty drastic damage to some of the houses as it just kept coming out of the lake. But it's called ice tsunami. And I was really surprised how quickly it overtook the landscape just in an instant.
I was too, and I was even more surprised how the people just stood there. I mean, maybe there wasn't anything they could do, but I don't think I would have been standing out in the middle of the yard and letting one of my kids play on the other side where I couldn't get to them.
I think they were in a state of disbelief. I think one of them even went out and picked up a large chunk of it and, dropped it and it shattered. I mean, and I may have been in a state of disbelief. I'm one that loves to stand on the front porch and watch a lightning storm. So there are certain things where I'm drawn to stuff like that. So I probably would have seen, how quickly it could have got to my, up to my feet and ankles and, up my shins before I'm trying to get out of it. You never know.
Chad, that sounds just like you.
I know. Nothing wrong with being curious.
There you go. Nothing wrong with being curious.
Well, we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit, and I would love, and Chad too, would love to have you talk about the Day of Atonement and the sacrifice.
Yeah, this was something that I came across in while I was researching some things, because this is something that's not so much tied with the flood, but then again, it kind of is. And I found some other information, Kay, that I'm going to throw into this that's not in the book. I hope it's okay if I give some information that's not in the book.
Oh, that's fine.
It may be some information that finds its way into the book I'm working on now, because that's how I came across it. But this was some stuff that I researched and did some additional phone calls and emails back and forth. In this case, my email back and forth and research was with Dr. Ken Johnson, who is a specialist in researching ancient Jewish documents and the church fathers and things of that nature. And so that's really where I kind of got into this. But this is in a section of the book called "Pleased to Meet You. Can You Guess My Name?" And it starts page 171, I think, in the book. There is a specific rebellious watcher named Azazel, who is mentioned in the book of Enoch and really doesn't factor in when people are talking about the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim and things of that nature. You don't often hear Azazel's name mentioned, but I want to read something for you out of the book of Enoch, which is actually what prompted this particular research. And I think you'll see, where I'm going with this, and we'll get into the Day of Atonement. But this is after the Watchers have rebelled. They have taken unto themselves women. They've produced their own offspring, the Nephilim. And this is the judgment of God against that act. It's coming from the book of Enoch, chapter 10. Some people know this as First Enoch, chapter 10. And I'm going to start with verse 1 and then just go just a little bit further beyond that. Says, "Then the Most High, the Great and Holy One, said to Uriel, Go to the son of Lamech," that's Noah, "and tell him and tell him, in my name, hide thyself. Reveal to him the judgment that is approaching, that all life will be destroyed by a flood of water that will cover the entire earth. Instruct him how he may escape, and his seed may be preserved throughout all the generations of the world. Now, we're familiar with that phraseology as the Lord speaks to Noah and says, the end of all flesh has come before me. That's in Genesis chapter 6, and we're kind of familiar with that. Here's where we get some information that you only find in the book of Enoch. I'm in verse 4. It says, the Lord said to Raphael, Raphael is another one of the archangels. Uriel is an archangel. Raphael is an archangel. The Lord said to Raphael, bind Azazel hand and foot. Now, Raphael does this because he has authority over Azazel. That authority has been given to him by the Most High. And we could get into the hierarchy of angels here. But this is a case where Raphael outranks Azazel. But he says, bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. Make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudiel, and bind him there, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face, that he may not see light. And on the day of the great judgment, he will be cast into the fire. And I'm going to stop right there with that. The thing of the Great Atonement actually comes to us out of the book of Leviticus. I think it's chapter 16. I don't have my notes in front of me, so I'm going right off the top of my head with this one. But it's the book of Leviticus, and this is a place where Aaron is being given instruction by Moses as to how this particular ceremony is to be carried out. Now, Aaron, earlier in the book of Leviticus, Leviticus chapter 10, lost his two sons, Nadab and Abihu. He lost them because they weren't doing things properly. And as we get to chapter 16, we kind of get an idea of what they were doing that they shouldn't be doing. And I think that Aaron is paying very close attention when Moses gives him these instructions. But Moses gives him instructions on a particular Day of Atonement sacrifice that's known as the scapegoat ceremony. And that's what you'll see mentioned, excuse me, in Leviticus 16, as you're reading through there, you're going to see the word scapegoat. You'll see the ceremony is described that first Aaron has to go in and offer sacrifice for himself and his family. He has to be purified so that he can enter the sacred space. So that has to take place first. That bullock comes out of his own flock. So that's the first step. But then he goes from there. This is for the entire nation, that they will see and that they will understand. And what happens is that there's two goats that are taken from the flock, and they are to be identical so that they cannot be told apart. And then Aaron, the high priest, casts lots. One of the lots says, reserved for the Lord. The other lot says, for Azazel. And if you look at that passage, every place that you see the scapegoat in Leviticus 16, if you're using an online resource that will allow you to look at the original language there, you will see that the word that's translated scapegoat is the Hebrew word Azazel, which I just read you as a proper name. So you have one that's reserved for the Lord and one that is reserved for Azazel. As that is done, they take a red cord and they tie it around the Azazel goat and they hold it facing the altar. They take the other goat and proceed with the sacrifice, the one that is reserved for the Lord. They proceed with the sacrifice as it should be done with that particular goat. Once that is done, Aaron puts his hands on the goat of Azazel, and the Azazel goat is led into the wilderness. Now, this is where Ken Johnson helped me a great deal, because he's familiar with a lot of these ancient Jewish targums and things that are passed down and kept up with the rabbis. He reads that sort of stuff all the time. I don't, so he helped me with this. He brought me some information from Yoma chapter 40, I believe it is, and it talks about how the goat would be passed from one priest to another through 10 succeeding stations. And when it got to the last station, that particular priest would take the red cord that was tied around the goat, and he would tie one end of it around a large rock at the edge of the crevice, and he would tie another end of it around one of the goat's horns. And then he would cast the goat off into the crevice. This ceremony was to reenact what happened that I just read for you in the book of Enoch. As we're going through that in the book of Enoch, the Most High says, ascribe all sin or place all blame on Azazel. And as you read a little bit further in the book of Enoch, you find out why. Apparently, Azazel was one of the initial watchers who just decided he was going to do his own thing. And he did this for a while, and that kind of caught the attention of some of the others who eventually decided to follow suit. He was the original rebellious watcher. This is recorded later in the book of Enoch. Let's see if I can give you a chapter for people who are going to go, where is this? Where is this? This is in, there we go. We're in chapter 10. It's recorded a little bit before that. I got to put my glasses on so I can see this again. One of the things all the reading will do for you is your eyesight is the first thing that kind of gets a little bit dim. Okay. Enoch chapter 86 says, I saw a star fall from heaven. It's a singular star. And then it talks later that other stars fall from heaven. So if anyone has the book of Enoch and they're like, well, what is he talking about with Azazel? It's in chapter 86. But it says, ascribe all sin to him. He's kind of where everything started. Well, when you get into Leviticus, that's exactly what is being pictured with this goat. And as they get it to that particular station, in that particular station, the priest throws it off into the cliff. And as the cord stretches, the horn is ripped off of the head of the goat, and the goat is dashed into pieces in the ravine. And then the priest will come back and report to the other priest. This particular ceremony is done on the highest holy day of the year. And each person is only allotted so much of a journey that they can take by foot, which I think could be a part of the reason why they used 10 different stations to perform this ceremony, that they were spread out. But the priest would come back from there and report to the priest at station number 9, and he would go back to the next priest, and so on until it got all the way back to the tabernacle where the original ceremony had started. And the report would be the cord turned white. If the cord turned white, that was a sign that everything had been done according to how it was supposed to be done. And so that was the procedure there. Now, an interesting thing that I saw in that is that Noah himself is the 10th from Adam, and you've got 10 stations. Is that significant? I don't know. I just found it interesting. But that's your Day of Atonement ceremony. There's some other things that were tied to that Ken Johnson dug out of the details for me. One of them being that on that particular day of the year, the gates of the temple complex would close on their own at the end of the day. And the pool of Bethesda, you'll read about that in John chapter 5, the waters of that pool would be troubled by an angel, and if someone, the first person they got into the water, would be healed of their infirmity. Now, you'll see that recorded in John chapter 5, where Jesus comes upon a man, and the man tells him, when the angel troubles the water, I have no one to help me. And Jesus at that time just straight up heals him right there and tells him take up his bed and walk. Well, it's interesting that in the Jewish archives, in the Jewish history, and again, got this from Ken Johnson, that about 40 years before the destruction of the temple, which would be around 32 AD, that these miracles stopped happening. The red cord stopped turning white. The temple doors would no longer shut on their own, and the waters at the pool of Bethesda would no longer be troubled. The interesting thing that happened around that time period would be the crucifixion of Christ. So the Day of Atonement ceremony is a very interesting study, both looking back to the days of Noah and the days before the flood with the rebellious watchers, and also looking forward to the ceremonies that the Jewish rabbis performed. It's just a fascinating read.
It sounds like it. Now, how does that also brings to mind the differences before Christ's crucifixion and now? How are things different now from then? The way that the communication between God and the humans. You don't hear of people walking with God the way, say, that Enoch walked with God.
Right. It's really interesting because when you get into the time of Adam, you have a situation where God walked with Adam in the cool of the day. When you get into the time of Enoch, it says Enoch walked with God. When you get into the time of Noah, it says Noah walked with God. And then when you get after that, you got some other things going on there. And it's kind of interesting how some of those things really develop. There's something that I came across today that I felt was really interesting, and it involves some of these sacrifices. And if we got just a minute, I'd love to give you this information, and then maybe we can rabbit trail off of some of that other. I don't know if either one of you have a Bible handy that could help me with some of the reading. If not, I'll do all of the reading here. But I've always had this idea in my study that all of the sacrifices that we think of and we talk about started or were began or put in place during the time of Moses. But my study is telling me that that's not necessarily the case. And I think I've come across some things that would seem to indicate that just a little bit. As we get into it, Genesis 3:21, we have the fall of man. And this is a case where the serpent had told Eve, "You will not surely die." But make no mistake, someone surely died. What we have in this case during the fall of man, at the very end of the judgments that's pronounced against the serpent, against the woman, against the man, you have a sacrifice, and it says that the Creator clothed them in the skins of an animal. There was a death. And as you read through the book of Leviticus, you'll find that these sacrifices were very highly regarded. It's a substitution. It is a sacrifice of blood for the sake of another. And that's what happened all the way back in Genesis 3:21, that a sacrifice was made. So that "you shall not surely die," and we go, well, they died eventually. There was a sacrifice immediately because there had to be restitution made. And the restitution was a substitution of one life for another. Now, if you look at any of the sacrifices in the Old Testament, or you look at the death of Christ, and you don't see it as a substitution, you're really missing something that's key. Because it was very clear to the ancient Israelites that this is exactly what it was. It was one life in substitution or in place of another, and that's why the blood had to be spilled. In the book of Jasher, when you read through that incident in the book of Jasher, it says that the clothing of skins, were to cover the shame of Adam and Eve. It was a reminder every time they put those skins on that a life had been given so that they could cover their own shame. I think that's a really interesting contrast. But I'd like to rabbit trail for just a minute, if we can, into Exodus chapter 30. And I don't know if either one of you has a Bible or doesn't have a Bible in front of you.
I do.
Let me know. You do? Okay.
I do.
If you got it, you can pull it up. That's fine. That'll help me with some things. Exodus chapter 30, verses 25 through 30, it's an area where Moses is giving the instructions of how to make all of the artifacts for the tabernacle and all of the things that will go into the tabernacle as far as the worship of that particular the entire procedure. Well, Exodus chapter 30 verses 25 through 30 talks about how to make the oil for the tabernacle and tells them that this is how you are to make it. You're going to do it this way. You're going to put these ingredients and everything together. And Kay, if you have it, start reading at verse 31, if you would, and read just the next couple of verses.
Okay. And thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, saying, This shall be a holy anointing oil unto me throughout your generations. Upon man's flesh shall it not be poured, neither shall ye make any other like it. After the composition of it, it is holy, and it shall be holy unto you. Whosoever compoundeth any like it, or whosoever putteth any of it upon a stranger, shall even be cut off from his people.
Okay, that tells you that that particular mixture of oil was set aside for sacred space. It belonged to God. It was for one particular purpose. They were not to make anything like it as an anointing oil or anything. It was never to be put upon someone else. And verse 33 says, whoever makes something like this and puts any of it upon anyone, even a stranger, shall be cut off. That word cut off is the Hebrew word karat, and it means completely severed. It's the same word they would have used if they were cutting off a body part or if they were to behead someone. It is karat. He shall be cut off. It's not like we're just going to set him aside for a little bit and then we'll bring him back in. He's going to serve his time and a time out. And then, no, this was an absolute severing of the relationship. He was cut off from the people. Now, I'm going to pick up in verse 34 because this is kind of the thing that really grabbed my attention. Verse 34, and the Lord said unto Moses, take unto thee sweet spices, stocti and onycha and galbanum, these sweet spices with pure frankincense. Of each there shall be a like weight, so 4 equal parts. And thou shalt make it a perfume, a confection after the art of the apothecary, tempered together, pure and holy. And thou shalt beat some of it very small, and put it before the testimony. That's the ark itself. In the tabernacle of the congregation, where I will meet with thee, it shall be unto you most holy. Now, I'm going to try to describe a little bit about what's going on in the tabernacle here. The ark itself, the Ark of the Covenant, is in the very back room of the tabernacle. It's a 15-foot by 15-foot cubical area, 15-foot tall, 15-foot wide, 15-foot deep, and it housed the Ark of the Covenant. That was the throne of the presence of God. That was super sacred space. Only one person could go in there. That was Aaron, and he could only go in there once per year, and only if everything was being done right. To keep him outside of that area was a huge curtain known as the veil. The veil was 15 foot wide, 15 foot tall, and over 4 inches thick. It was very specifically constructed, and it was said that even a team of wild horses on each side could not tear this thing apart. There was to be no accidental separation of that veil, exposing the glory of God to man. Okay, which tells you really some interesting stuff that happened during the crucifixion when the veil is rent in twain from top to bottom. That terrified the Jews. And if you don't see that in the Gospels, you're really missing something that you can pick up in the book of Leviticus. That absolutely terrified the Jews when that happened. In front of that veil were 3 pieces of furniture. On one side of the room was a table that 12 loaves of bread rested on. On the other side of the room was a candlestick where that oil that we talked about just a minute ago, where we read about, that oil was to keep that candlestick burning. And right in front of the curtain, right in front of the veil, was an altar of incense. That altar of incense is where these spices that we just read about was to go. Okay? It was separated from the ark by that veil. It was outside the presence of God. It was cut off from the presence of God by that veil, by that interrupting curtain. But that's where it was. Aaron was to every morning bring this incense to that altar and burn it as a sweet-smelling savor before the Lord. But he wasn't able to enter into the Lord's presence. He was cut off. He also handled the oil with the candlesticks every morning. The high priest was the only one who could do this. Now, when you read Leviticus 10 about Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, you'll find that they burned this incense and they did it improperly, and they weren't the ones who were supposed to be doing it. And when they left that area of the tabernacle and got out in the courtyard, a fire came out of the tabernacle and consumed them, and they died. So to do this improperly was really, really not in your best interest. You better be paying attention, and Aaron was. Okay? When you get to verse 37 of what we're reading here in Exodus, it says, "As for the perfume which thou shalt make, ye shall not make to yourselves according to the composition thereof. It shall be unto thee holy for the Lord. Whosoever shall make like unto that to smell thereunto, or to use it as a perfume, shall be cut off." That's our word karat again, separated permanently from his people. Now I want to give you, in connection with that, something out of the book of Jubilees. Now, the book of Jubilees, I quoted from it in a couple of places in my book, and I gave some background as to why this book can be a useful book. In short, it's a part of a collection of ancient Jewish manuscripts known as the pseudepigrapha. It's called the pseudepigrapha because we're not really certain who the authors were. That doesn't mean it's all made up and that it's not valuable information. It's valuable information. We're just not certain as to who the author was. That was kind of common in the time period that this was put together. It dates back about 200, 250 years before Christ. It was a highly regarded book of the Jews and the Jewish rabbis, and they quoted from it often, and they were very familiar with it, so I felt like it was a worthy source of information for us. This is Jubilees chapter 3, verses 26 and 27. This is right after the judgment in Eden, where Adam and Eve are being cast out of the garden. They are being cut off from ever going back in there, and a veil is going to be put up. Verse 26 says, "And he," that's the Lord God, the Creator, "made for them," that's Adam and Eve, "coats of skin, and he clothed them, and he sent them forth from the Garden of Eden." Now, according to Genesis, when did this happen? This happened during the time of that judgment. There was a substitutionary death that resulted in those coats of skins being available for Adam and Eve, and then they were karat. They were cut off from the Garden of Eden. They were sent out, never to come back. Curtain was put up. Veil was put up. They were protected from the presence of God. Why? Because they could no longer enter sacred space. They weren't pure anymore. Verse 27 of Jubilees 3. "And on that day on which Adam went forth from the garden, he," that's Adam, "offered a sweet savor, an offering, frankincense, galbanum, stocti, and spices, in the morning with the rising of the sun from the day," presumably every day after that going forward, from the day when he covered his shame. Now that's the identical phrases and the identical concoction that we just read in Exodus chapter 30. I had long thought that all of these sacrifices and everything that were instituted by Moses, they date back prior to the flood. And I think you can see a lot of them there. So when you're asking how God communicates with man, in some senses, the communication had not changed a whole lot up until the time of Christ. But in other senses, it does change drastically. When we get to Genesis chapter 4, we see Cain and Abel. We see Abel bring an offering. We see Cain bring an offering. What's the difference? Abel's offering is firstling of the flock. There's a shedding of blood. There's a substitutionary death. Was this done on a particular day of the year? Not positive, but maybe, because they knew to bring an offering. Cain brought of the first fruits of his vegetation, his garden that he had grown, and he brought those. There's no substitutionary death, and there's no shedding of blood. And what did the writer of Hebrews tell us? Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. You get into Genesis chapter 9, Noah, post-flood. He's doing the same thing after the flood. He's offering a sacrifice after the flood, firstlings of the flock. Many people think he took 7 clean animals, so that when they got off the boat, he could offer a couple of the clean ones as sacrifice. Not how it worked. Not how it worked. The book of Leviticus very clearly tells us that the sacrificial animals that were acceptable to sacrifice had to be, if it was a male, it had to be at least 7 days old. If it was a female, it had to be at least 14 days old, and it had to be younger than a year. Once it was old enough to reproduce, it couldn't be sacrificed. So the animals that he took on the ark were not the animals that he sacrificed when he got off. He had to wait until the first fruits in the new world, the first birth of the flock, the firstlings of the flock, had reached 7 days old, and then it could be sacrificed. So it's a very different look at that as far as how those things went. I'm also going to give you Genesis 14:18, if I can, real quick. This is a reference to Melchizedek. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. He was a priest of the Most High God. In Genesis 14:18, Melchizedek is interacting with Abraham. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb, and Chad, I know you're taking notes. You can call me out if you want to, but I think that the time of Abraham was several hundred years before Moses.
Why do you think that, Mark?
Well, Abraham would be where the nation of Israel came from his seed. You had Abraham, you had his child Isaac. His child Isaac gives birth to Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel go down with Joseph into Egypt. They're led out of Egypt by Moses. Moses leads them through the desert. Moses is hundreds of years after Abraham. At least 400 years after Abraham. Abraham is dealing with a priest of the Most High God who brings forth bread and wine. Same sacrificial or same ceremonial thing that you're reading in Leviticus, Abraham is partaking in with Melchizedek in Genesis 14. All of these offerings, these sacrifices, these sin offerings, they didn't start with the Mosaic Law. They go back at least to that time, and I would suggest that they go back prior to the flood.
Fascinating. You just basically, you can look at the generations with each birth.
With each verse, you can see as it comes forward, each time you can see that this is something that gets passed down. What Moses is doing is he's reinstating something that Abraham was very much aware of. But as the children of Israel went into Egypt, into slavery, Moses is bringing a nation of slaves out of Egypt. They know nothing other than what they have seen in Egypt with, the Egyptian gods. They're not living during the time of Joseph and his brothers where they served Yahweh. They are slaves to the Egyptian Pharaoh. That's who Moses is bringing forth out of Egypt. And as he brings them forth, he reintroduces them to Yahweh, who brings them out of Egypt, and reinstates this sacrificial system which dates back before the flood. So I know that was a long rabbit trail, but hopefully it's something that, someone out there will find interesting on some levels.
Well, I've always found it interesting that when Christ was crucified, he was the ultimate perfect lamb, the ultimate sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, there was no more requirements that people take from their own flocks, because
Right.
Jesus had made that sacrifice himself, so they were never called to do that again.
Well, and what you have, even when he stood before the Jewish rabbis and they were questioning him on a lot of things, he told the Jewish rabbis, hey, before John, that's John the Baptist, before John was the law. But now the kingdom of God is preached. Everything changed with Jesus Christ. Everything changed. The kingdom was ushered in, not completely fulfilled, but ushered in. The time of the law had been fulfilled, and we moved on to something else. Paul writes about this a lot, and it's a real interesting, in-depth study, the writings of Paul, especially in Galatians, how he deals with the law and how the law was imperfect and designed to be replaced, and it was. We still have some today that want to go back to that. Paul would say, "Oh, foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that you want to go back to the very thing you've been delivered from?" Listen, these guys, as you read through the book of Leviticus, you'll find it was a scary thing to stand into the presence of God. I mean, Aaron watched the death of his 2 sons before his very eyes. Aaron had to do these things every single day, where if you do one thing wrong, you're going to have a very, very bad day. Who wants to live under that? We now live under someone who has fulfilled all that. The writer of Hebrews refers to him as our high priest, Jesus Christ. And the writer of the Hebrews says, whereas before the people were just absolutely terrified in the presence of God, and rightfully so, and we can show a lot of that. But, now the writer of the Hebrews says, let us come boldly before the throne of grace. Why? Because of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm going to suggest that boldly and carelessly are 2 completely different things, but, we are not living in that area that, where everything was done under the law and everything was sacred space, and if you're impure, you're in a really bad place. So, it's a different world today. The atonement that we have in Christ is absolutely phenomenal. And often overlooked. It's really not taught a whole lot in today's churches. And I'm sorry, I have trailed a whole lot. There's probably someone listening to this going, what in the world does this have to do with the flood of Noah? And I understand that. I apologize, okay, for rabbit trailing off of that.
Oh, don't.
No, that was good.
Yes.
I was gonna ask you, speaking about the Levitical laws, I know that a lot of people, just like the tribulation, certain subjects people want to divide on. There's certain people out there that think that it's unclean to eat pork and stuff of that nature, but that's another thing. Talking about Noah, I know that after the flood, when they came off the boat, that God had opened up the palate.
Right, and before that, everybody it gives us indication in Genesis that God had given them vegetation to eat, both man and animals. Now, that's not to say that man didn't eat meat, because there were a lot of people that were obviously in rebellion of the laws of the Creator. But after the flood is over, that is a directive that's given to Noah, that you shall now eat meat. He's also told that at that point he needs to be afraid of animals to a certain degree, and animals will fear him. So whereas at one time there was this, I'm not going to say that everything was domesticated in the same way that livestock would be, but I think the animal kingdom was vastly different before that. But when you get after the flood, now you have wild animals that are not domesticated, with the exception of the clean animals that are livestock. But it's interesting. The definition between clean animals and unclean animals is really one of those things that scholars today still wrestle with, because there's not any one system that really nails it and explains everything. Some people think it has to do with the way they digest their food. Clean animals are those that chew the cud and things of that nature. Some think it has to do with the animals that were suitable for sacrifice. You only bring to your table what is suitable to bring to God's table, but the book of Deuteronomy clearly tells us that they were able to eat other wild animals from the field, such as deer and things of that nature. So what made an animal clean and what made an animal unclean is a really interesting study and a hotly debated topic. I dealt with it just a little bit in the book because I felt like I had to. Noah was told to bring 7 pairs of clean animals and 2 pairs of unclean animals. So he had to have an idea of what qualified as a clean animal and what qualified as an unclean animal. So that's why I felt like I kind of had to deal with it a little bit in the book. It's interesting that the list we get is in Leviticus chapter 11. This is right after the 10 chapters of Leviticus deal with clean versus profane versus holy space, sacred space versus polluted space, and that's what the first 10 chapters of Leviticus kind of deal with, is the holiness of God, what is clean, what is what is profane, and those types of things. And then you get the list of the animals on the back side. I have to wonder if some of that ties into the behavior of the animals makes them unclean versus clean. In other words, some animals will eat dead flesh for food. Some animals will return to their waste, their excrement or their vomit as a food source. And, those things are clearly in the range. Those types of animals are clearly in the range of the list that says unclean animals. So it's a very interesting study and things that are very hotly debated among scholars, even to this day.
Yeah, I've had this discussion with Justin Fall of the Fourth Watch, and one of the things that he actually brought up was, basically the pigs back in those days, basically they used them as, they were like the garbage dumps. They were garbage disposals, everything. People took their feces and everything rotten and all the junk that they had, and they would take it down there and just dump it in the pig pens, and the pigs would eat it.
Yeah, pigs will eat anything, and I mean they still do today. But there's a lot of other animals that fall into that same classification. There's a number of animals that I would consider good for food, and another number of animals that I don't necessarily. There's plenty of stuff for me to eat without eating certain things.
But one of the points he brought up was that they're not raised, or they don't use them like that anymore. These are farm raised pigs nowadays. That's the thing.
Yeah, and we are not under the law. So whether someone decides to eat pork, which is the hot debated topic, whether someone decides to eat pork or not eat pork has nothing to do with their holiness in the sight of God. Their holiness in the sight of God, if it was based on their actions and their behavior, they would fall way short. That's why we needed Christ in the first place. So, that whole analogy of, hey, according to the old Mosaic law, we weren't supposed to eat these things. They were unclean animals. I choose not to eat pork because I don't think it's healthy. I choose not to eat seafood because I don't think it's healthy. I have enough friends who have shellfish allergies that, I can look at that and go, you know what? If I don't eat shrimp on a regular basis, I'm not going to develop a shellfish allergy. And, there's some nice fillets of other fish that I can eat that are delicious, that I get protein from, that I enjoy. And I don't miss the fact that I don't eat shrimp and lobster. I don't avoid those things for religious purposes. I just choose not to eat them as food. That's my own personal preference.
So, I mean, that's the thing is, like I said, there's a lot of people nowadays that believe that they have to observe the Torah. You hear them say all the time, the Torah, and it's like, we've already moved past that. The Levitical laws and everything have all been done away with. That's fine if you want to do those things and you think that it brings you closer to God. I have no problem with people doing that, but when they start saying, if you're not doing this, then you're not honoring God, you're not keeping His commandments, that's the only issue I have with it.
Well, and I think it's interesting that, Chad, when you look at the Old Testament, it was very clear during that time that there was, you had the Israelite proper, the citizens of Israel, then you had the priests that were a part of a priestly line, then you had the high priest that was a step up from them. And you can see it in studying the temple complex itself. And I shouldn't use temple complex. I'll use the tent of meeting or the tabernacle, because that's what Aaron and Moses dealt with specifically. Later on, it became the temple, and that kind of got profaned later on in the history of Israel, to the point where God threw up His hands and cast them off the land. He said, "You have polluted this land to the point where you can't live here anymore." They were cut off. They were put in exile. There was a very legitimate reason for that, because they were not abiding by the laws and the rules of the land. But when you get back to the time of Moses and Aaron and the tabernacle, same type of principle, but they were doing their best at that point to comply and to live into and up to those things. Well, the high priest had much higher standards than the priest, and the priest had much higher standards than the average Israelite citizen, because they were in the presence of sacred space at all times. That's where they operated. That's where they did their work. So there was a complete separation, or I don't want to say a caste system, but there was a complete separation of the priest from the common folk and the high priest from the priest, etc. When you get into the New Testament, Paul tells us we're all a kingdom of priests. We are all priests. There is no respecter of persons. As you get into some of his letters, book of James, you give respect to this person over this person. There is no more of that. Jesus made it very clear. Before John was the law, but now that John has come, the kingdom is preached. Paul spent page after page after page of the New Testament trying to explain this principle to us, and we still want to return to the law because somehow that makes us feel like we're doing something that is approvable in the sight of God. And it's really, if it makes people feel like that they are doing their best to serve God, I'm okay with that. But if they look down at someone else because they don't do that, then they're misunderstanding some things there.
Exactly. And, I also feel like that kind of falls under works. People are doing this thing. It tells us that, works alone are not going to get us there. That's the thing, is by grace and faith alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see that in the book of James, where he talks about, things. And Paul mentioned that also. So interesting sidelight of conversation for sure.
Yeah, and I got another one. I guess
Okay.
I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna throw another one at you since you brought up Melchizedek.
Okay.
Sounds to me like you've probably studied a lot more than I have. I'm still studying on Melchizedek, but a lot of the research that I've been looking at, I see they say that Jesus came in the order of Melchizedek. Are you familiar with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could you talk about that, please?
Well, I mean, I don't believe that Melchizedek was a appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. I think he was a person who was the king of Salem, who interacted with other kings, as we read in that passage with him and Abraham in Genesis 14. So he was a known king of Salem who also served in the role of a priest. Now, that itself was extremely rare. And that's where he was a type of Christ. I don't believe we see plenty of examples of Christ in the Old Testament, the appearance of the visible Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, and we can get into some of those because those are just absolutely fascinating. They'll come out a little bit in my next book as I'm working on it, but the Melchizedek itself, I believe that he was an actual person. I think he was of the lineage of one of Noah's three sons. I believe that he and Noah would have been familiar with each other because there were some things going on between the three sons of Noah that really fracture the ancient world before it even gets underway. One of the questions that I get asked by my wife, which kind of prompted this book too, was we get to the end of book 1, and you've got the flood, you've got Noah, his three sons, their wives, they're on the ark. And I didn't bring the ark ashore in that book. For those of you who haven't read the book, it's a cliffhanger. I kind of leave you hanging out there dangling with, well, wait a minute, he didn't finish the story. That's because if I had finished the story, it would have been about 6 books long. This is really a lengthy story as we get into it. But in this particular book, we do bring the ark and begin the new world, and we will see the family fracture right away. And it's a very distinct event that fractures the family and separates the 3 brothers. And you will see out of the line of Seth, that is, out of the line of Shem, I'm sorry, out of the line of Shem, you will see the holy bloodline develop out of his line and follow through all the way through to Abraham. There's very strong, well, I don't like to use the word strong evidence because it sounds like I'm trying to prove something that really can't be connected. Abraham and Noah were contemporaries. They knew each other. And that will come out as this book kind of unfolds. That's a connection that most people wouldn't make. They wouldn't see Abraham as being someone who would have known Noah. They see Abraham as somewhere in the distant down the road. But Abraham would have known Noah and known him very well. And he has this interaction with Melchizedek, who is the king of Salem, which tells us at that point in time, even though we don't have a lot of information on Salem, it tells us at that point in time, by the time we get to Genesis 14, that we have got very well-developed nations going on at that point in time. And, this is something that becomes an interesting aspect as it unfolds.
Well, I got another question for you, and I'm sure you've probably been asked this one quite a bit. Did Noah take the bodies of Adam and Eve on the ark with him?
I have been asked that question once. The book of Jasher indicates that at the death of Adam, that Adam was buried, or that a ceremony was observed for the passing of Adam. I've got asked that question. I can't, there's stories, but I can't find anything that specifically says this is the list of things that Noah took on the ark. There's some things that you would think absolutely have to be there. One of the things that I found in reading some of the Jewish stories from the Jewish rabbis and things of that nature is an indication that the skins that Adam and Eve were clothed with were passed down from generation to generation, and that those did go with him on the ark. Did the body of Adam actually go? I haven't really found anything that I can say confirms that for me.
Well, I think I read it in the books of Adam and Eve. There's 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was in there that it could have been the Book of the Cave of Treasures, but I know one of the sources that I looked into, they said that that was one of the things that Noah actually went to the cave where Adam and Eve were buried and took their dug their bodies up and took them on board the ark with him, and that it goes on after the ark came to rest that basically Noah lived. He lived out of the ark. That was the thing, is until he died, he basically stayed there. He would come out of the ark and wander around, but at night he would go in the ark and sleep. And that whenever he finally passed away, his sons basically covered his body in honey, and they sealed the ark, and they put up signs and told everybody no one was allowed to go near it after that.
It's interesting the amount of ancient literature that's there and the detail that's given in it. We have this idea that there's nothing out there that kind of gives us any information. The thing that you have to filter everything through is what is reliable information that, has been commonly accepted and approved as an accurate passed down through time, and what is information that may have gotten added to or embellished. And I would say that, as stories and legends get told, that, great storytellers are no different today than they were back then. Telling a great story, spinning a great yarn, adding a little bit here and there. I don't think anybody would have considered that profane at the time, to the point of, oh, well, this is a sacred story. I shouldn't add anything to that. I think there's quite a few incidences where, the story gets bigger the more it's told. But you can get back to the heart of the story if you dig deep enough.
Well, one of the questions that I asked myself, why would Noah do this? Why would he take the bodies of Adam and Eve on the ark with him? I come to the realization or conclusion that he must have been trying to protect the source.
Well, when you say protect the source, what do you mean?
The source of humanity.
Okay. I think the one thing that would kind of lead me as a dangling thread out there that I'd have to really examine would be the case and the evidence for ancestor worship. And there were people after the flood that did worship Eve. But, did they worship Adam? Possibly, but that would lead me to believe that Noah would not have done that because it would have led to an ancestral worship. However, that being said, you can also look at the case of Joseph saying, "Do not leave my bones in Egypt. Take me with you when you go and bury me in the cave of my fathers." So, you can make arguments. As I said, we're getting into the area of speculation where both sides can argue vehemently and possibly do nothing more than stir up dust, but it's fun dust.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Did either of you get to watch the Neil Adams video that I sent the link of?
I did.
Yeah?
Is that the one about the continental drift and everything?
Yeah. Did you get to watch that, Chad?
Yeah.
About 8 minutes long. I was curious as to whether how you found that. What was your impression? How interesting was that, and the concept and the idea?
I've actually seen quite a few like that. I know that there's one, I can't think of the gentleman's name, but he's well renowned. People know who he is. but he basically talks about the continental drift and talks about the land masses splitting open the fissures and the water coming up from below and everything.
Would that be Walt Brown? Is that who you're thinking of?
That could be
Because I
Walt
know
Brown.
that Walt Brown talks about the land masses splitting and fissures and things of that nature, and the Earth, ripping apart at the seams. His book. His name is Dr. Walter Brown. I can't think of the name of his book right off the top of my head, but it's in about the 18th or 19th generation of the book. He just keeps adding more stuff. It's a terrific resource volume
Yeah.
for that. I found it very interesting. I came on it, the video for Neil Adams. I came on the heels of some other research I was doing from a prominent archaeologist or geologist named Samuel Warren Carey, who was an Australian geologist. He had put in about 30 years of research in the mid 1900s. He actually just passed away in 2002, so not that long ago, but he published a book in 1976 that, and he was a professor, a tenured professor at a college. He published his book, his findings, his theory in 1976 of an expanding Earth. After more than 30 years of research, I was fortunate. My brother heard me talking about it and the things I had researched online. He actually found a copy of the book and got it for me, which I thought was really cool. But his idea was that if you take the plates of the Earth and you shrink the Earth, that these plates all fit together, and a much smaller planet would have smaller bodies of water. The water would be inside the Earth, and that you'd have primarily one large landmass that would be tropical in its seasonal flare, not nearly as drastic as what we have now. Now, this is coming from a geologist who's just studying the geology of the Earth. He's not trying to promote anything along the lines of biblical data. A German geologist by the name of Ott Christoph Helgenberg worked independent of Samuel Warren Carey. He did his work about 40 years earlier, and in his work, he was coming on the heels of a German geologist by the name of Alfred Wegener. Alfred Wegener promoted the Pangea theory and the breaking apart of the continents and continental drift, and Helgenberg went back and said, no, you know what? You can connect everything if you just shrink the size of the Earth. It all fits together, hand and seam like a glove. And he had invested about 25 to 30 years of research as a geologist, came up with the same exact theory that Samuel Warren Carey had. Neither one of them knew of the other one's work. Their works are independently published. In fact, Helgenberg's work is still only available in Germany, it's still only available in the German language, I should say. Was never translated into English. Alfred Wegener's work was translated into English, and he was absolutely ridiculed and laughed to scorn by the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. But after about 25 years, he kind of began to gain some support. That was in the early 1950s that he gained support. But the idea was that the entire globe, the outer crustal continents that we see, plus or minus some continental shelves that we have, if you shrink the globe into a smaller globe, they all fit together beautifully. And I thought that video by Neil Adams really did a nice job of putting that forth. I came upon that after I had read some of the work of Samuel Warren Carey, and I felt like that I just had to put that in the book.
Yeah, they talked about the vegetation, and they're basically all being pretty much identical on different continents and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the vegetation being 2 and 3 and in some cases 10 times the size of the vegetation that we have today. So the atmosphere with more oxygen, the vegetation being larger. Samuel Warren Carey even weighed in about the size of the dinosaurs and how the Earth's gravity would affect that. I mean, it is really a detailed read.
Yeah, I know that, was it Kent Hovind that talked about the dragonflies that were, was it 7 feet wide with the wingspans that they couldn't even fly with the oxygen environment of today because the oxygen environment back in the past was way higher than it is nowadays.
Right. It's and they've got fossils that will show these larger insects and larger animals. I mean, we've got all kinds of things in the fossil record that show many of the same animals we have today, just a much larger size of them. And again, this kind of gets back into our Ice Age conundrum of, okay, we know this happened, we have evidence that it happened, we're just not exactly sure how it happened.
Yeah, it's interesting because you know that it had to have been flash frozen instantly, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have been. Because that's the thing. If I remember correctly, a lot of the research I did, these animals were still standing. Also,
Yeah.
that's the thing. So I mean, like you said, they were still standing. They still had food in their mouths, undigested food in their stomach that hadn't even made it all the way down to the bottom of the stomach with the acid and everything. So,
Right.
Clearly, this happened, like you said, instantly, pretty quick.
Yeah, it is something that just leaves you scratching your head, and to have a theory to explain that outside of a catastrophic event, I just don't have one outside of a catastrophic event. And some people may look at me and say, you're leaning on that as a crutch. No, I'm saying that all arrows point towards catastrophic event. So
yeah.
I appreciate you tackling that tonight for me, Mark. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I don't, we've covered a lot and run in a lot of different directions tonight. I don't know if we've kept close to the notes or straight off the notes, or, I think I rabbit trailed a few times on things that you probably weren't even, didn't even have in your list of questions somewhere. So
Sometimes that's the best way to do it, though.
hopefully it's made sense to someone, right? Well, how much time do we have left, Kay?
As much time as you want, Mark.
I got one other thing I kind of want to share with you guys, but I know that, when you put everything together in its final form and put it out there, you kind of, have to fit within a certain time zone so that somebody can listen to it in one sitting without, needing to go get a haircut or
Well, that's the great thing about these podcasts is people can put them on their MP3 players or phones and they can take them with them.
Yeah. Well, let me throw something out to you because you asked me a while ago about the manifestations of God and, Noah walked with God and what happened after that and how does God manifest himself today. And I want to throw something out to you guys. This is something that actually came up in a conversation I had with BDK of the Omega Frequency. But it's my thought that in reading the Bible, as you're reading through the scriptures, and to me, it's a miracle that we hold this in our hands. I mean, regardless of what your particular view or concept of inspiration is, and I know different people have different concepts and ideas about that, the fact that we can date the thing that we hold in our hand to a time period that absolutely predates Christ, which would take us back at least 2,000 years, and much of it into a time period that would date around the period of the Babylonian captivity, which takes us into about 600 years before Christ. So now we're looking at about 2,600 years, bare minimum, and we're able to hold this in our hands and read it. I mean, the fact that it's been preserved for over 2,600 years to the point where we can read it, keeping in mind that most civilizations, as soon as they are conquered by someone, all of their history is either destroyed or confused or wiped out or intermingled into other, civilizations' histories. And we see that over and over and over again. We've got great societies that we try to research. We don't know anything about them because they were conquered by someone else. And the first thing that new conquering nation did was destroy all the historical background of the people they conquered. Well, we have this information from the Hebrew people that dates back at least 2,600 years. And on the bare surface of that, I find it absolutely fascinating. I love to sit down and read it, but I want to throw out a couple of things for people to consider as they're reading their Bible. If you're reading through your Bible and you're like, I've got to get in 5 or 6 verses today, maybe a full chapter because it's my daily Bible reading and prayer. Let me throw something out for you in this digital information age that we can do that really makes things more interesting. And I think you may enjoy this. Kay, I'm going to read a verse for you, and I'm going to read a verse for Chad. Chad, I think I'm going to start with you first. I'm going to read a verse, and then I'm going to ask you a question about it, okay? This is coming out of Genesis chapter 34, and I'm just going to read it verbatim from the King James Version of the Bible. It says, and Hamor communed with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longeth for your daughter. I pray you, give her him to wife. Now, Chad, I want to ask you, in this verse, is Shechem a male or a female?
Well, it says him and her, right?
Well, I'll read it for you one more time. Hamor communed with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longeth for your daughter. Is Shechem a male or a female?
He's a male.
He's a male. Okay. You're up, Kay. Are you there?
I'm here.
You ready to go? You buckled up?
I'm buckled up.
Not much chance of an injury. Okay, here we go. Couple of verses down from that. And make ye marriages with us, and give us your daughters unto us, and take our daughters unto you, and ye shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade therein, and get your possessions therein. Verse 11. And Shechem said unto her father and unto her brethren, let me find grace in your eyes, that what ye shall say unto me I will give. Okay, in this verse, is Shechem a male or a female?
A male.
I'm going to read that for you one more time. And Shechem said unto her father,
Oh.
and unto her brethren, let me find grace in your eyes.
I still say a male.
Okay.
Because Shechem is talking about his daughter's father, isn't it?
Chad, I'm going to let you chime in here.
Help me out, Chad.
Are they both named Shechem?
And Shechem said unto her father and unto her brethren, let me find grace in your eyes. What ye shall say unto me, I will give. In that verse, is Shechem a male or a female?
Female, because it said her.
So it would seem. Here's the thing. As we read through things in chapter and verse, everything is separated for us, okay? And what I read you was two separate verses, and I'm going to put them in context for you, and you'll see where the details become important. And I understand what Kay is saying. Well, wait a minute. It can't be male and female. It's still got to be a male, because we determined it was a male up there, so it's still got to be a male.
I should have asked you if there was a comma and where it was.
As we put these verses together and as we read through them, in that one verse, it seems like Shechem is a male. Soul for my son Shechem. Okay. In the other verse, Shechem said unto her father and to her brethren. It seems like Shechem is a female. As we read the entire passage, what we find is that Shechem, the male, the son of Hamor, is talking to the father and the brethren of the people who are of the woman that he wants to marry. So he's talking to her father and her brethren, not his father and his brethren. But when you separate the verses, it does get a little bit confusing, because it sounds like in one verse that Shechem is clearly a male. It sounds like in the other verse, Shechem is clearly a female. And here's what I want to say is that when I read through passages sometimes, I will take complete chapters and I'll remove the chapter and verse, and I'll string them together on one large Word document so that I'm just reading the entire document without any break of chapter and verse. And I read it in the same way you would sit down and read a novel. And when you do it that way, you'll see that the writer is telegraphing some things in the way it's worded that you read right past if you're reading it chapter verse or just pulling out a verse. If I'd have just pulled out verse 11 and read that to Chad and said, Shechem said to her father and unto her brethren, is that a male or a female? Wow, that's a female. Then we go to the other verse. No, wait a minute, that's a male. It can get confusing, okay? The Bible reads a lot easier if you will take the time to remove some of the chapter verses, especially in the Old Testament, and run all the sentences together and then put it in a Word document or even print it out and just read it as you would a novel. These were put together by writers and editors who wanted you to have something that told the story, particularly in the Old Testament. Okay? Now, I gave you that so that I could give you this. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1 tells a story that we're pretty familiar with. It's the story of a young child named Samuel and an aging priest named Eli. And the child, verse 1 says, the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli, that's Eli the priest, and the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. And we're accustomed to reading through this as we get to it. And we read into the later verses, it came to pass at that time when Eli had laid down in his place, His eyes began to wax dim. He got sleepy. He couldn't see. And ere the light of God went out in the temple of the Lord, that's the candlestick we were talking about an hour ago. Ere that light went out where the ark of God was, Samuel, who wasn't a priest, he was a child. Samuel was laid down to sleep, and God called to Samuel. The Lord called out to Samuel and said, Samuel says, here am I. And he runs to Eli and he says, hey, Eli, you called me. Here I am. And Eli goes, I didn't call you. Go lay down. And we get to verse 6, and the Lord calls him again. And Samuel jumps up and runs into Eli and he goes, hey, Eli, here am I. And Eli goes, son, I didn't call you. I'm trying to sleep. Go lay down. And you're hearing things. Get away. I didn't call you. Third time this happens. Now, verse 7 says, Samuel did not yet know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed unto him. Verse 8, and the Lord called to Samuel again the third time, and the scene repeats with Eli. And finally Eli says, next time you hear that voice, it must be the Lord talking to you. Say, speak to me, Lord, because I'm now listening. We skip ahead to verse 10. And the Lord came and stood and called as at other times. Now, as we're reading through that, we're hearing, and the word of the Lord called to Samuel, and the word of the Lord called to Samuel, and the word of the Lord called to Samuel. And in our mind, we're envisioning a disembodied voice that's calling out to Samuel. But as we put it together in this sequence and we read as one entire paragraph, something else can show us or can come to light for us. In verse 1, it says, and the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. I'm going to suggest that word of the Lord is an identity of a person, not a disembodied voice.
Not the Spirit of God?
No, this is a visible person. As we get a little bit later, the Lord calls again, okay? And the Lord calls again. Well, there we see the interchange of the Lord and the word of the Lord. Now we get to verse 7 and it says, Samuel did not yet know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord revealed. There's a key word. The word of the Lord was revealed unto him. Well, he didn't know anything about what's going on. But Eli tells him, the next time you hear this voice, this disembodied voice, because that's what we're all thinking as we read through this, say to the disembodied voice, speak, Lord, because I'm listening. Well, let's see what happens. Verse 10, and the Lord came and stood and called as at other times. I'm going to suggest that a disembodied voice doesn't stand anywhere.
No.
That is anthropomorphic body language. There is a physical manifestation known as the word of the Lord that we can see in other places of the Old Testament, and it's right here in Samuel chapter 3. Verse 10 tells us it comes and it stands next to the child Samuel and called as at other times, the three other times that we had just read. He was standing right there, but wasn't yet revealed to Samuel. Now, we get down to the end of the chapter. Verse 21 says, and the Lord appeared again and revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh. How? By the word of the Lord. I'm going to suggest that this phrase, the word of the Lord, is a reference that you will see numerous places in the Old Testament that indicates a physical appearance of a visible manifestation of Yahweh. Now, with that in mind, I want to turn us over to John chapter 1, Gospel of John. I'm going to move a little bit forward in time. And we get to John chapter 1, and John opens his gospel this way in the very first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That same was in the beginning with God. Now, John's not just making a clever attempt at being eloquent. He knows his Old Testament. And he gets a little bit further in the first chapter of John, and he says, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. This is John's way of introducing us to the incarnation into human flesh of the visible Yahweh in the Old Testament, the word of the Lord. And if you look at that phrase and look it up, you're going to see it in several other places in the Old Testament where the word of the Lord that we read past in our lazy reading through the chapter verse breaks, if we put them all together and begin reading them, something different comes out of the text because the writer's trying to telegraph something to us. This is a visible appearance of Yahweh in the Old Testament that was revealed to Samuel that John writes about in John chapter 1. So I just wanted to throw that out. It's something that, I think as we read through the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, it gets very helpful if we'll break it out of the chapter and verse designations and just read the text for what it is, because the writer is trying to telegraph a message to us that we sometimes miss, overlook, read right past, or just become completely disinterested in when we're all broken up in chapter and verses.
It's very reminiscent of the angel of the Lord, which was Jesus before he came in the flesh.
You will see that designation as well. The angel of the Lord, I think you'll see that in numerous places. Probably the most familiar story of that is Moses at the burning bush. It's specifically in those, if people will go look that up in their Bible, the story of the Moses and the burning bush, it's a story we're very familiar with. If you'll sit down and read that, you'll see that there are two entities in the bush.
Yes. And also, remember, that was another thing, is that he had Moses go and hide in the cave and created a cloud above him, and that he projected his image onto the cloud so that way he could see him.
Why? Because if no man can see God at any time lest he die. Well,
exactly.
Maybe I'm going out on a thin limb here, but if you become visible to me and I die, it kind of really inhibits our opportunity to communicate. Puts a real end to that real quick. So, you'll see that throughout the Old Testament, things like that we read right past. It's something that as I get into the next book, there's some things there in the Old Testament that I'm going to try to bring out. This was just one that I wanted to show as an example because it becomes so obvious that word of the Lord is a physical manifestation that Samuel saw. Just really very obvious there.
Did you ever listen to the episode that BDK and Justin did on the angel of the Lord?
I have not heard that one, no.
I'm going to have to send you that one, yeah. Yeah, I mean, they line it out every time that the angel of the Lord appears all throughout the Bible until Jesus comes in the flesh, and they basically, they lay it out that he was literally watching over the bloodline that he was going to come through. And basically like a shepherd watching over his flock until he came in flesh form.
I find it very intriguing, the different places that we will see that. I'll tell you another place that you'll see it, and I find this very interesting also. If you look in the first chapter of Jeremiah, it talks about the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, and the Lord is calling Jeremiah to ministry, and Jeremiah says, I'm just a child, no one will listen to me. But it's interesting, it says, and the Lord reached out and touched my lips. And I'm going to say that a disembodied voice doesn't reach out and touch anything. But as you read through that first few verses of Jeremiah 1, you're going to see the phrase word of the Lord and the Lord, which if you're looking at the name of the used there, it's the name Jehovah, Yahweh, used there. You're going to see them used interchangeably as if they are just synonyms. And in this particular aspect, they are. They absolutely are. But I'm going to tell you, that's another place where you see the visible Yahweh calling Jeremiah as a prophet. And it's a real interesting read when you see how it goes back and forth, back and forth. The word of the Lord came unto me saying, and I responded, and then the very next verse it says, and then the Lord said unto me. It's like there's three people there having a conversation when it seems like maybe there's only two.
It's the word of the Lord is the power manifested through Jesus Christ.
Well, in the Old Testament, it's actually an entity.
Well, that's what I meant with manifestation.
Yeah. In the Old Testament, it's actually an entity. And I think the phrase word of the Lord seems as if it would be a, you know, a voice, a leading of, you know, of such, more so than a physical manifestation. But as you read in certain passages, it's easy to see that it is a physical manifestation.
Wow. I'm really glad you brought that up, Mark.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to join you guys tonight. I don't know if we covered everything we wanted to cover, but hopefully we covered some things that people find interesting. As I told you before we got started, Kay, I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you the last time around. This for me is a journey of discovery, and my books are just all about me being able to search out questions that I'm seeking answers for, and I'm just recording, you know, my journey as I go, and giving people an opportunity to eavesdrop on that as I go. I did notice, and I don't do interviews for the sake of selling books. We haven't really promoted my book very much at all, other than mentioning the name and talking about some things in it tonight. But I did notice that the last time I did an interview with you, we got some pretty good response from your listening audience, and I wanted to publicly thank you for that and thank the listening audience for that. It's always encouraging when you see that, to know that, you know, people are receptive of, you know, some of the things that you're spending time to study and research, that others are finding that of interest and of, you know, particular edification for themselves, and that's always that's always a good result in the end.
Well,
Yeah,
you're
it's a
welcome.
well-written book. It's very well written, and I mean, you know that I poured over it. You know that I've poured over it, and that's the thing, is that you know, it's clearly about 400 pages, and it's got diagrams and figures and all sorts of stuff to look at. So I mean, there's a lot of information in there.
Well, the one I'm working on now picks us up from there and takes us through the Tower of Babel event. And one of the things that I really spent a lot of time researching, because I had just as many questions about the Tower of Babel event as I did the flood. So I spent a lot of time researching that. And we're going to get into some of the reasons why I feel like the Tower of Babel event did happen, why it was necessary, what was going on. So, you know,
Yeah.
hopefully that will be an interesting study. If we can get it, my goal is to have it ready by the time my birthday rolls around in March. So we'll see. That's kind of at this stage.
Are you
That's the target date anyway.
gonna touch on the monkey men and the elephant men?
Oh, you're talking about from the Book of Jasher?
Uh huh.
I'll have to bring that out. I don't know how deep I'm going to get into that. I've actually had some conversation with a couple of Bigfoot researchers with regard to that, and I won't mention any names, but it's interesting. As you read through the book of, it's funny you should mention that. As you read through the book of Enoch, you'll find in a lot of places Enoch writes his visions, and he uses a lot of symbology, and the symbology that he uses to separate different nations and people groups and things of that nature is different classifications of animals. And it's a very interesting the way the ancient Jewish writer would have used that and what they were telegraphing by it.
Yes.
Well, Mark, you know that we're going to have you on again before
Next week.
before In the Beginning comes out, because we did cover a lot tonight, but there's still more to cover in the beginning that we didn't get to yet. Your book is just so packed.
Yeah,
Well,
we'd have to do at least 10 episodes just to kind of breeze over that book. There's just way too much. It's kind of like Gary Wayne's book. I mean, you can't do it all in a couple episodes.
Gary Wayne's book is a research volume. That thing is over 800 pages, and it is one of those that you have on your shelf, and it comes off the shelf more times than it just sits there. But it is a research volume for looking things up. He put a tremendous amount of research into that book, and have all the respect in the world for him, because I know how much time and effort it takes to do that.
Yes. Yeah. And I'd like to say to the audience, too, and about the audience, we have such wonderful listeners, and they know that anything that goes on deception detection, we are on a journey for the truth. And we don't sugarcoat anything. We don't bring people on just to fill up time. We are all on that quest. And you're part of that journey, Mark. And our listeners are very intelligent, and they pick up on that. And to the listeners, I am so happy to hear that you've picked up Mark's book. And if you haven't, trust me, it is worth the read, and you will go back to it. It's so well done. Can you
Yes.
tell everyone where they can purchase that at, Mark?
That's available through all of your online resellers. I think Amazon actually has the best price on it right now. So Amazon is an easy way to find it. It is the title is End, E-N-D, The Beginning, and we went with that title because we were bringing the beginning of the world to a close with the flood. So end the beginning. We're using the word end as if it's a verb. The title of the upcoming book is Beginning the End, because we're going to take a trek from the start of the New World and see how an 8-person campsite developed into a fractured world of a new world filled with strife, turmoil, and kingdoms that just couldn't get along with each other, leading up to the Tower of Babel. And then if the Lord leaves me around long enough and I can find some additional material, the third book that I'm accumulating stuff for picks up after the Tower of Babel and picks up with Abraham and talks about his journey as to how the nation of Israel came into being. And it's called The End is Where We Begin. And that's going to take us up through where the nation of Israel came from and why they were God's chosen people and things of that nature. And I think there's a lot of questions there that need to be answered as well.
You just got us waiting, Mark.
Well, let me get back to my keyboard and get some fresh batteries in it, and we'll see where we go with things.
Can you tell also, well, first, do you offer an autographed book? And second, can you also let people know where they can contact you?
My website is Mark Colmes Author, and that's spelled, Mark is spelled with a K, not with a C, but it's markcolmesauthor.com. Under that, there's a tab called Books that has the book End the Beginning. And if you want to order a personalized copy, I do have some copies here at the house. I'll gladly personalize it for you and send it to you. It costs a little bit more than getting it off of Amazon because, I'm not buying it in huge bulk like Amazon is, and I have to cover shipping and things of that nature. So, if you do want one that way, I do include some extra things. I include lens cleaner cloth that is imprinted with a timeline from Adam through the who did I go through? I went all the way through Jacob and Esau, I think, on that timeline. But a timeline cloth that crosses from Adam all the way through Jacob and Esau shows you in whose lifetime the Watchers came, in whose lifetime the Tower of Babel happened. And it gives you an idea of whose lifespan overlapped whose lifespan. In looking at things that way, I'm a very visual person. And so I thought that was something that was worth having printed up. So for the people who want to order the book directly through me, the book is I think with shipping and everything, it comes to about $23. But I include that in there. I include a couple of extra bookmarks in there and things of that nature. I try to throw in a few extras when I send it out that way, but it's available off my website. The other thing is I'm available on Facebook. You can look up Mark Colmes Author on Facebook. I'm on there from time to time. I'm on Twitter. I do my best to answer email. The easiest way to email me is through my website. There's a link that says contact me. It'll send the email directly to me. If anything that you've heard in conversation, or if you bought the book and go, wow, I'd really like to ask Mark a question about this because I don't understand what he's thinking here, feel free to send me an email. I do read them. I try my best to respond to each one as time allows. So, I'm accessible when it comes to that.
And you've also got a podcast too. Why don't you plug that as well?
I kind of suspended the podcast a little bit, but yeah, thank you, Chad. I appreciate it. All the others are still out there, the ones that the interviews I've done before. But as I got into working on this particular book, it was like I've got to focus on certain things, and I've had a couple people go, why did you stop doing your podcast? And it's like, well, I really enjoy doing it, but as you guys know, that is very time consuming.
Especially the editing.
Oh my goodness. It is very time consuming. And I have, for the guys that do a podcast and get one out every single week, guys and ladies, Kay, they get one out every single week. I just absolutely applaud you more than you know. It is a very demanding task. And for those of you that are listening to shows like this, that, Chad and Kay, and you heard them mention Justin Fall and BDK and others that are involved in putting together on a weekly basis. I want to tell you that production day comes around really quick. It involves a lot of work, and in some cases it involves a lot of reading because, Kay and Chad can't have conversations with their guests, such as Gary or myself, that really have much of a flow to them at all if they're not familiar with the work that Gary produced, or in my case, the work that I produced. So the people that do these podcasts put a tremendous amount of time into it. So, if you hear their program, you enjoy something, that they've produced, give them credit for doing that because they put a lot of time and labor into it. I enjoyed doing it. I love talking with people. I loved asking questions. I got to talk to some fabulous guests. I've still got links to all of them. But yeah, it got to where I had to say, okay, I've got to separate what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to be able to do on a regular basis. And right now I wanted to concentrate on trying to get the book finished by the end of the year and get it released in March.
Well, the podcast is just on hold, right? Just on hold. You're going to pick it back up, right?
Probably. I will tell you, it's something that I enjoy doing, but the production time on the backside of it is it's tough for those people that have a partner behind the scenes that helps with that stuff. Man, you are blessed because it's a lot of work, and
it's a labor of love, though.
It is.
It is fun to do. It is enjoyable to do. But wow, the workload's heavy, and I applaud you guys.
Thank you. We just give God all the glory because He's the one that leads us and gives us the strength and makes it possible for us to do it. And we've met some wonderful people doing this, such as yourself. We've made friends, and He's just opening the doors up. It's amazing.
Oh, yeah. Keep having guests just fall in our left and right.
I will tell you, and I've been very fortunate. I've met some wonderful people, some podcasters such as you guys and Justin and BDK and others that I've been just so very fortunate to join them on their programs, and what an honor it is. I've also been able to meet a number of scholars and people that are so much more scholarly than I am. I'm a reader and a researcher. I read a lot. I research a lot, but I've been able to talk with people like David Roll, who's legitimately, he's an Egyptologist, archaeologist. And when you guys get those DVD sets and sit down and watch a couple of episodes, you're going to be amazed some of the information that he has in those. That's just mind blowing. It's boggling, the stuff that he has researched and developed over the years. But he's also someone that is going to be able to read Egyptian hieroglyphics and Akkadian and all of these other things. I've talked with people like Ken Johnson, who does so much stuff in the early church fathers, rabbinical texts and things of that nature, and learned so much from him. And Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Heiser, if you've never heard of him, look him up on.
I love Dr. Heiser.
Yes.
On YouTube. This man is everything Zechariah Sitchin claimed to be. Dr. Michael Heiser, I think it's 12, 13 different ancient languages that he not only reads, but, goes and tears apart and researches. He is an amazing source of information when it comes to that. And Zechariah Sitchin wrote some great stuff, but I consider it science fiction because he's not really a scholar. And a lot of the things that he did write, when you get into the text that he brought it out of and the tablets that he brought it out of, you can see where, as Chad, as we were saying a while ago, you can see where he may have embellished just a little bit. Made for some great books, fascinating.
That's putting it lightly, the word embellishing, because, like I said, that's one thing Dr. Heiser does. He doesn't sugarcoat it when he starts talking about stitching.
Well, and I will tell you that, and I said I put him in the category of science fiction, and some people be careful saying that on Facebook. The folks, the ancient alien astronaut Sitchin crowd, those folks, God bless them.
Well,
They don't have.
we love the ancient alien crowd. They don't realize that the word alien is actually something else.
Well, they also don't have the thickest of skin when you question something along those lines. I actually own 8 of Zachariah Sitchin's books and have read most of them. So, it's not like I'm speaking out of turn, having no idea what he wrote. I've read most of his books, enjoyed them, but as far as being, reliable resources for information, not so much. And I'm going to say it that way and just be kind about it. Hopefully, I'm being kind about it. Anyway.
We would like to have Dr. Heiser on. We've just heard he's very, very difficult to get a hold of, but he's one that we're not giving up on. We figure when it's time, God's going to make it happen.
Well, I will tell you, I'm very fortunate to have gotten an opportunity to talk with him and to be able to, put some of the things I'm studying in front of him and say, hey, Mike, I am looking at this as it compares to this. Can you give me an opinion? Am I on the right track here? Can you shed any light on this subject? And, sometimes it's a week or more before I hear back from him because he is extremely busy. He does travel. He has a full-time job. If you look at his website, he keeps up with 3 blogs. Mm-hmm. I have trouble keeping up with one. He keeps up with 3. Rumor has it he actually has a wife and a family. So, to say that the man has some stuff on his plate is an understatement. I think the work he produces and the amount of work that he produces. Oh, and he does a weekly podcast. So, the amount of work he produces is just phenomenal. I don't know how he does it, but incredible resource. Can't say enough about how valuable his research, study, and information actually is.
Yeah, I'd love to get into a deep conversation about spiritual geography with him.
It would be deep. Be sure you roll up your pants before you sit down for that one because it's going to be a deep conversation.
I think Chad's he loves conversations like that. But Mark, we want to thank you so much for coming on, and would you please do the honor of saying the closing prayer for us?
Oh, I certainly will. Lord, thank you so much for this opportunity. It has been a pleasure to talk with Kay and Chad this evening, and what a fun conversation that we have had. Hopefully, in every aspect, we have been respectful not only of your word, but of the truths of your word that you wanted to have revealed for us. Hopefully, in some way that we have been used or been usable for your service to speak a word or to open a door where you can speak to someone else. Because that, Lord, is the best that we can offer, is to be usable, to be servants, to be in some way someone that would bring information that would bring someone else closer to you, to start them on their own journey. And we know that you will meet them and pick them up and carry them on the way. So thank you again for this opportunity, and for those that are listening tonight, we just hope that they have been encouraged, enlightened, maybe challenged by all the things we've discussed. If their curiosity has been piqued at all, we count it a blessing and a treasure to have shared this time together, not only with our host, but also with them. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. In the beginning, Mark Colmes.
Yes.
Check it out.
We want to thank you all for tuning in tonight. It's been a wonderful journey. We pray you all have a blessed week. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Sky, gazing far into the night. I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light